So we're going to talk today initially about walking over ground poles. There's many reasons why this is one of my simplest but most prescribed exercises. Number one, as you can see, it's currently pretty muddy here. We're in the heart of winter in California, which is admittedly pretty mild, but the horses are pretty fuzzy and it's muddy, as you can see. Sometimes when you're dealing with bad weather, that's a time where people don't exercise their horses as much, and that only breeds restriction as far as I'm concerned. You can always get your horse out and walk them, and nearly always you can walk them over ground poles. Many people know the benefit of ground poles, but they don't apply the exercise consistently enough to get the value out of it. So I always say, if you're going to set up poles and walk your horse over them, you need to do it at least 20 times in a given day. So that's 20 times continuously. Otherwise, you're just not doing it enough to recruit the nervous system and develop the patterns that we want. Secondly, it's important to know why you're doing ground poles. It's not about getting the horse to pick his feet up really high. In fact, it's not really about the elevation of his limbs at all. It is about the fact that ground poles pre-measure the stride. What it does is it embeds a very correct rhythmic gait, because the horse is not trotting along in his normal habituated ways. You've measured out the steps. Also, they've done a lot of research, mostly overseas, that show walking over ground poles or stepping over any raised object actually really stimulates the base of the horse's neck. And as we all know from Masterson method, if you can stimulate the base of the horse's neck, then you can create a whole host of reflexes through the horse's body and open up new pathways. So walking ground poles is, again, one of the most valuable things you can do. So we're going to go ahead and demonstrate it. I'm going to tell you how to modify it, how to space your poles, both on the ground. So we'll start here, and then we'll do it under saddle. So we're going to turn your attention to these poles here behind me. This is my horse Corazon. We'll get him moving over the ground poles. These are spaced at about 2.5 feet apart. And these are riser blocks that I sell on my website store, and the poles are just landscape timbers that you can get at the local hardware store. They're easy to move around, and they're not expensive, and they're rot resistant. So for simplicity of setting things up, this is what I recommend. So you want to just develop a nice purposeful walk, send the horse straight over the poles, and you're looking for one step in between each pole. You'll notice I don't lunge from the bit or with side reins or anything that restricts the horse. I really want the horse in a nice neutral posture, which is how I would describe Corazon's posture right here. So if we observe his neck, we don't see any twisting or tension. He's just in what I call a comfy position. As far as I'm concerned, horses need to spend more time in this position. So this would be how you would set your poles up to develop good rhythm, as I said before. Many people space the poles too far apart at the walk, and then what that does is create a tension or overreaching pattern. If anything, err on the side of setting them up a little closer together. But as I said, these poles are spaced 2.5 feet apart, and Corazon's a big horse. He's almost 17 hands, and this is a good distance for him. So your horse might be a little narrower. So that's a nice steady rhythm. Now we're going to move over to these poles over here. So if you've done your basic poles, which I just demonstrated there, if you've done that for about a period of 2 weeks, let's say you're doing that exercise 3 or 4 times a week, consistently for 2 weeks, then you want to add a little bit of novelty so the horse is not getting robotic. What we know about the neurochemical reaction in the horse's brain is that they need to be in a calm and curious state in order to develop new neural pathways. And if they're getting bored stiff about what you're doing, they're not getting those pathways down. So we're going to cut right in front of you. So the easiest way to modify your pattern is to vary the spacing between the poles rather than make it more complicated than that. So let me show you what I mean. You see these poles behind me are spaced such that Corazon will take 1 step between these first poles. 1 step, and then 2 steps here, 2 steps here, and then, whoops, that should have been 1 step on the last one. Let's demonstrate that again and see if we can get it correct. So what I've done is adjust the spacing so that he has to have a little bit more brain hoof involvement, so it captures his attention a bit more, hopefully. and it prevents him from just getting robotic in his pattern. So this would be the next place that you go. One step, 2 steps here, 2 steps here, and 1 step here. And you don't have to set them up exactly like this. I'm just giving you an idea about if you're noticing your horse is getting a little bit robotic or stale, about your basic setup of pulls, which is the ones we started with. You would then play around with adding or subtracting steps between the pulls. And you'll notice these are not raised. They don't need to be raised. You can raise them if you have an excess of blocks available to you. And again, let's say this was my chosen exercise for the day. I'll go ahead and stop cortisone. I would do that 10 times across the poles in each direction. And I would keep track of that. So if you're in a phase of, say, rehab, or it's really wintry and you're not able to be in an active building training phase, maybe you're doing a lot of walk exercises and you're finding yourself doing a lot of walk cavaletti. There's no harm in doing them every day at the walk. I caution people from doing too many ground pulls consecutive days in the trot or canter, but certainly in the walk you can do them every day. And it is important to kind of keep track how many reps you're doing. So like I say, 20 times is my general starting point. But if you're in these phases of walking for long periods of time through the winter or rehab situations, then you would want to either add duration or intensity. So you would either add repetitions starting in intervals of 5, or you would start to raise and elevate the pulls. That would be adding intensity. But you don't do both at the same time. So let's take a break and come back and check this all out under saddle. So let's have a look at the ground pulls in the walk under saddle now. I've got our demo rider Sam on Diamante, who is a half Arabian, half quarter horse, and same spacing on the pulls. We have the chance to look at the movement of a different horse. The first thing I observed in watching this horse's movement compared to the horse we just saw on the ground is that when Diamante crosses the poles, you can watch him this next time, he tends to elevate his front legs a lot more than Corazon did. Some people get excited, they're like, ooh, that's a good thing. It actually is not a great thing. The movement is out of balance back to front. We don't want that exaggerated pulling themselves forward from the front end. So I would prefer to see that smooth out. See how he really snaps his knees up there? That's Diamante's habituated patterns. Those of us that ride him know is he tries to do everything with his little pipe cleaner neck and his front end. He tries to be a little bulldog, and you always have to help him be in better balance. And we're seeing the same thing here on the poles. So to help him get more suppleness, what I've asked Samantha to do is to stretch his neck a little bit lower, to get rid of that tendency to want to tighten his neck, and to invite his nose to kind of poke out and forward. So there we see a little bit higher lifting of the hind legs that time to kind of match the amplitude of the front end. That's what we're looking for, is that balance. So we'll ride him one more time over these poles here, Samantha, and then we'll move to the poles that are set up further down the arena there. Those of you watching, walk ground poles are a way I kind of covertly get riders to spend more time in the walk. Those of you who've heard me talk about joint fluid needs to be circulated at least 10 to 12 minutes in the beginning of your ride. So many people just forget that. They hop on, they're eager to go, they start trotting, and then the cartilage takes a lot of concussion. If you're gonna need to spend 10 minutes in the walk anyway, use your ground poles, you know, and so that's a way I trick riders to spend the 10 minutes they need to do walking, is I give them something interesting to do, which is ride over ground poles. So let's move down here and explore the same spacing that we had with the horse on line, now with a different horse. And one of the ways I like to modify this, and Samantha, you can start to do this now, is you'll walk across these poles, and then after you clear the last pole, make a stop and do a turn on the forehand and change direction. So notice I'm not asking Samantha to try to ensure that this horse is in a particular frame or body posture, whatever language works for you. We want to create just range of motion, mobility. This is the sort of technique you would do in the beginning of a ride. And so I want the horse, we see him starting to chew on the bit there and release his jaw. We just want him to be comfortable. So I'm looking at his tail carriage, which is nicely soft. It's not clamped against his body or looking stiff. He moved a little bit better off the leg that time. And Samantha's just keeping a nice kind of neutral rein contact, so it's not totally loose. We see him kind of fumble with the hind end there. He's kind of working out the kinks is the appearance he gives us. And that's the whole point. If you do these kinds of ground pole setups, and we already covered the spacing that we have here, if you do these in the beginning of your ride, instead of kind of lollygag around, you're gonna get more out of your initial few moments in terms of waking up the nervous system, in my opinion. Not that it's terrible to lollygag, that's totally fine sometimes. But so now let's say, continue across one more time, Samantha, and then we'll talk about, again, how would you modify this exercise if either your horse is getting very bored and listless, and or you have a horse that tends to be quite strong in the front end like Diamante. So what I'll have you do, Sam, you finish your turn, perfect, is you're going to cross the poles at an oblique angle. So you're going to try to walk across the poles from this corner all the way to this opposite corner. And we're going to leave the spacing as it is, and he might fumble around there in the middle and kind of mix things up, but we'll see what we get. That'll be good for him. The reason I like riders to cross, so you're aiming for this corner here, more of a diagonal slant. There you go. Yeah, perfect, like that, like that. Yeah, there, good. So that was actually a good angle at the camera. So get yourself turned around and we'll do that headed back. The reason I like to cross poles at a diagonal angle for horses that are tight in their front end is it causes that forelimb to step out away from the chest wall rather than this habit of just falling forward. There we go, that's okay. These poles are a little bit narrow by the time Sam gets to the end of her line. Let's try it one more time, Sam. She's kind of running out of poles. If you had a longer 12-foot jump pole, it would formulate a little bit better. But what you're looking for as she rides to the camera is this diagonal line of travel. There you go. He's kind of fumbling around and bumbling, but that's all good. Sometimes when they hit the poles like that, it's my indication that, oh, we did interrupt their movement pattern, which allows us to put in new movement patterns. So sometimes people get frustrated if their horse bumps the pole. But really remember, what you're trying to do is, I mentioned in the beginning of the video, activate the base of the neck, stimulate new movement patterns. That's what all of these kinds of techniques are for, so that you can get more out of your training session. So we've just demonstrated walking obliquely across the poles, as well as when you walk back and forth across the poles under saddle, you can throw in a turn on the forehand or a turn on the haunches. Now, the last thing that we'll demonstrate here, Samantha, is I would like you to demonstrate adjusting your horse's frame. So as you turn this next time and walk across these poles, you're going to ask Diamante to go as low as he'll stretch his neck. So you can just go ahead and let the rein slide through your hands. Try to pick up the tempo a little bit. He's getting a little too relaxed. There you go. There. Yeah, that's where you want his neck. There we go. Keep it active. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. And then you're going to go ahead and gather your rein contact back up for the working walk. And this is something riders just kind of forget that they can do when they ride walk poles, is they can and should ask their horse to be in different frames. So you're going to be, oh, sorry, I didn't explain that clearly. That's okay. You can let him stretch down. And then the next time you ride across the poles, you're going to gather the reins up and keep him in a working frame so that we can watch in the video the difference in his movement between the two frames. So playing around with the adjustability of his body posture. So just like that. Good. Just like that, and keep the tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Good. So if anything, actually you see a little bit freer movement there when he's in the working frame. He had a more animation to his step. I'm just pointing this out because I think it's really interesting things to observe. The different results you can get from the pole. In a way, when he has his neck down really long and low, which is beneficial for his back, he gets almost so relaxed to the point of going to sleep about it, which may be what you want in your own horse at home. Maybe you've got a high-strung or younger horse that you want to get into that deep relaxation state. In Diamante, he's not a young horse, so we can see that using the different postures, body postures with him, while going over the poles, we get a totally different result in his step. So my takeaway is I like to go between all the different postures as I'm walking over poles, because as I said, this is something I do on a really regular basis, is walk over poles. This is a low concussive, super easy to perform exercise. So we've just covered in this video how to incorporate your walk ground pulls either in hand from the ground or under saddle or both. And we discussed how to space them, how many times to do them, how to incorporate them in your regular routine, and then some simple ways on how to add novelty so that you can keep the neuromuscular system tuned up and awake rather than having it get robotic and bored. So hopefully this has all generated some questions for you, and we'll get to those in the live chat. Thanks for tuning in.